There's a funny thing that happens every few years in the entertainment industry. Someone in Hollywood looks around, notices that piracy is on the rise again, and suddenly acts shocked that people aren't happily paying more and more money for a worse and worse product. And that's really the heart of this whole conversation. Piracy didn't come back because people suddenly became immoral. Piracy came back because the legal market became hostile. The Verge's article about the rise of rogue streaming boxes gets close to that truth, but it stops just short of saying the quiet part out loud. It diagnoses the symptoms, but not the disease. And if you want to understand why piracy is back in full force, you have to start with the disease. The Verge lays out a pretty straightforward narrative. Piracy boxes like Superbox and VC Box are exploding in popularity, and they're being sold everywhere. Farmers markets, church festivals, Facebook groups, you name it. They're marketed as a one-time purchase that replaces cable and streaming subscriptions, and they promise thousands of live channels, sports, and on-demand movies with no monthly fees. The hardware itself is legal, the article says, but the usage isn't. And the reason people are turning to these boxes is because streaming has become too fragmented, too expensive, and too inconvenient. Sports rights are a mess, enforcement is ineffective, and consumers are fed up. And all of that is true, but it's also incomplete, because the article focuses so heavily on these flashy rogue devices that it completely ignores the biggest piracy machine in America, the Amazon Fire Stick. And this is where the conversation really starts to shift, because while Superbox and VC Box make for good headlines, the Fire Stick is the quiet mainstream piracy device hiding in plain sight. It's the one your coworker uses, the one your uncle uses, it's the one your neighbor bought preloaded from a guy on Facebook Marketplace. And the reason it's so popular is simple. Jailbreaking a Fire Stick requires absolutely no technical skill. You don't need to be a programmer, you don't need to exploit a vulnerability, you don't need to hack anything. You just toggle a setting, install a third-party APK, and you're done. And Amazon absolutely knows this. They'll never admit it publicly, and they never will, but they absolutely know. They know which apps are being sideloaded, they know how often users toggle install unknown apps, they know how many Fire Sticks spend 90% of their time in apps that aren't from Amazon App Store. They have the numbers, data, statistics. They just don't talk about it. And the reason they don't talk about it is because the Fire Stick's reputation as the easiest device to jailbreak is part of why it dominates the market. Amazon doesn't want piracy, but they do want Fire Stick market share. And they know exactly why people buy these things. So when The Verge frames piracy as some fringe, underground phenomenon, it misses the bigger picture. Piracy isn't fringe, piracy isn't niche, piracy is happening on the most mainstream streaming device in America. And that alone should tell you that this isn't a story about criminals. It's a story about consumers who feel like the legal market has stopped respecting their time, their money, and their patience. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the streaming industry's self-inflicted wounds. Let's start with the price hikes, because this is the one that everyone feels. Netflix raises prices multiple times a year now. Disney Plus has doubled in price since launch. Hulu's ad-free tier is now more expensive than cable used to be. Max, Paramount Plus, Peacock, they've all raised prices repeatedly. And the irony is that streaming was supposed to be the cheaper alternative to cable. That was the whole pitch. Cut the cord, save money, watch what you want when you want. But now you're paying cable prices for a product that's worse than cable ever was. And then there's the ad creep. This is the part that really drives people insane. Because it's not just that streaming services are adding ad-supported tiers. It's that they added ads to the paid tiers. They want you to pay a monthly subscription fee and watch commercials. And not just a few commercials, more intrusive commercials, and now even pause screen ads. You pause a show to read a subtitle or answer a text, and suddenly you're staring at an ad for Doritos. And the only reason people tolerate it, on Tubi or the Roku channel or Pluto TV, even though Pluto TV is more live, is because those services are free. You're not paying for Tubi. You're paying for Netflix, Max, Paramount Plus, and they're still forcing ads on you. And the funniest part is that audiences have been trying to skip ads for decades. One of the biggest reasons people bought VCRs in the 80s and 90s was to fast forward through commercials. When TiVo came out in the late 90s, it revolutionized ad skipping. You could pause live TV, you could fast forward with precision, and advertisers panicked because TiVo's data showed exactly where people were skipping ads. So what did the industry do? They made ads unskippable by embedding them into the content itself. Picture-in-picture ads during sports games. This replay is brought to you by XYZ Company. On-screen logos, animated graphics. They learned nothing from the TiVo era, and now they're repeating the same mistakes with streaming. People avoid ads, so services add more intrusive ads. People skip ads, so services make them more unskippable. People get annoyed, so services raise prices anyway, because fuck you, that's why. And that brings us to the biggest irony of all. Hollywood and the streaming services now want the government to come in and solve the problem that they created for themselves. They're the ones who killed physical media. They're the ones who killed licensing. They're the ones who killed unified catalogs. They're the ones who killed consumer ownership. They're the ones who turned streaming into a fragmented, overpriced, ad-stuffed mess. And now they're crying foul because consumers found a workaround. It's the classic corporate cycle. We broke the market, now please regulate the people who escaped our bad product. Wah. The irony is almost comedic. Hollywood wants the government to protect them from the consequences of their own business model. And that's where Fragmentation comes in, the real villain of this entire story. Because if you go back to the early 2010s, piracy was almost completely eradicated. Not literally zero, because piracy will never hit zero unless you break every computer on the planet. But it was the lowest it had been in decades, and the reason was simple. The market was unified. You had Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon Prime. That was it. Everything was in one place. Prices were low, the user experience was simple, you didn't need 10 subscriptions, you didn't need to hunt for content, you didn't need to remember which service had which show. It was the golden age of streaming. But today you need Paramount Plus for Star Trek, Disney Plus for Star Wars and the MCU, Max for Game of Thrones and Harry Potter, Peacock for Yellowstone and The Office, Prime Video for Lord of the Rings and The Boys, and Netflix for Stranger Things. It's not a competition of quality, it's a competition of territory, and consumers are exhausted. They're not being asked to choose a service, they're being asked to choose which parts of culture they're allowed to access, and that's not a sustainable model. And if Fragmentation explains why piracy came back, YouTube explains why Hollywood is losing the culture war altogether. Because here's the uncomfortable truth the industry never wants to say out loud. The #1 streaming service in the world isn't Netflix, it's YouTube. YouTube has more watch time, more users, more daily engagement, and more cultural reach than every paid streaming service combined. And the people dominating that platform aren't Hollywood actors. They're creators, they're vloggers, they're challenge video guys, they're educators, they're commentators. They're people who built their audiences from scratch, without studios, without networks, without gatekeepers. And the numbers speak for themselves. A single MrBeast upload can pull 50 million views in a day. Mark Rober can drop a science video and hit TV ratings territory in a weekend. Dude Perfect can partner with Nerf or Walmart or Pepsi directly because their audience reach rivals and often surpasses the biggest shows on cable. These creators don't need Hollywood. They don't need agents. They don't need studios. They don't need middlemen. They have direct access to brands because they have direct access to audiences. And that's the part that really stings for the traditional entertainment industry. Hollywood used to be the gatekeeper. YouTube blew the gates off the hinges. And part of the reason creators thrive on YouTube is because they control their own image. They control the camera. They edit the narrative, the tone. They decide what to show and what to hide. And that's a massive shift from the reality TV era, where participants had zero control over how they were portrayed. Shows like Wife Swap and My Super Sweet 16 were built on exploitation. They were designed to humiliate people for entertainment. You weren't watching these shows to see families grow or learn or bond. You were watching to see meltdowns. You were watching to see rich kids cry because their Lexus was the wrong color or because their $10,000 invitations had a typo. And the people on those shows had no say in how they were edited. Their reputations were shaped by producers who needed drama. Vlogging is the natural evolution of that format, but without the exploitation. Creators get to tell their own stories. They get to decide how they're seen, and audiences gravitate toward that authenticity. They'd rather watch someone be real on their own terms than watch a network manufactured drama for ratings. So when you combine YouTube's dominance with the streaming industry's fragmentation, you start to see the bigger picture. Piracy isn't the only thing Hollywood is competing with. They're competing with creators who don't need them, who don't rely on them, and who are pulling bigger numbers than their most expensive shows. And that brings us back to the Verge article, because this is where its blind spots become obvious. The article treats piracy boxes as the main threat, But the real threat is the ecosystem that made those boxes appealing in the first place. It ignores the Fire Stick, which is the actual mainstream piracy device. It underplays the role of price hikes and ad creep, which are the primary reasons people are fed up. It doesn't acknowledge YouTube's dominance, which has fundamentally changed how people consume entertainment, and it frames piracy as a moral issue instead of a market-driven reaction. Because that's the real thesis here. Piracy is a market reaction. Piracy rises when the legal option becomes inconvenient. Piracy falls when the legal option becomes convenient. We've seen this play out over and over and over again. Steam unified PC gaming and piracy plummeted. Spotify unified music and piracy collapsed. Early Netflix unified streaming and piracy nearly disappeared. The formula isn't complicated. When you make the legal option easier than the illegal one, people choose the legal option. When you make the legal option harder, more expensive, more fragmented, and more annoying, people look elsewhere. And the streaming industry has spent the last decade making the legal option worse. They raised prices, they added ads, they fragmented content, they removed shows, they canceled series mid-season, they deleted entire libraries for tax write-offs, they made it harder to find content, harder to afford content, and harder to enjoy content. And now they're shocked that people are turning to piracy again. But piracy didn't come back because people suddenly became immoral. Piracy came back because the legal market stopped respecting the audience. So when Hollywood goes to the government and says, please fix piracy, what they're really saying is, please protect us from the consequences of our own decisions. Where? They want regulation to solve a problem they engineered for themselves. They want enforcement to fix a market that they broke. They want the government to punish consumers for reacting rationally to a system that no longer works. And that's the irony The Verge never touches. Because the truth is simple. People aren't choosing piracy, they're choosing convenience. And right now, piracy is winning. Not because it's free, not because it's rebellious, not because people want to steal. Piracy is winning. Piracy is winning because the legal alternative has become a maze of subscriptions, price hikes, ads, and frustration. And until the industry fixes that, no amount of government intervention, no amount of lawsuits, and no amount of moralizing is going to change the outcome. If Hollywood wants piracy to decline again, the solution isn't complicated. Lower friction, lower prices, fewer ads, less fragmentation, better user experience. In other words, make the legal option better. Because history has already proven that when you do that, piracy fades into the background. And when you don't, piracy fills the vacuum.